back to the forefront last night, and I want to start there. Country singer John Rich posted on X last night. We can bring this up on the screen. And said, and I hadn't heard this, by the way, in years. This used to be a catchphrase among the right. John Rich posted and said, "Who killed Seth Rich?" Seth Rich was the former DNC staffer who was murdered on the streets of Washington, D.C., and it sparked a lot of questions. Yes. Let's restart. Yes. All right. For those of you on YouTube, we're going to be right back because it only started on YouTube and it didn't start on the other platforms. And we got to have everybody on board. So hold tight. We'll be right back. Don't leave us.
I see it on X, by the way.
Is it live on X?
Yeah, I'm clicking the retweet button right now.
Oh,
Or should I
hey.
not? Yeah.
Guys, can you hear us and see us on X?
I see myself tweeting it out, actually.
Yeah, I do too. I see it. I think we're good. All right. Well, just kidding. To those on YouTube, stay right where you are because we are not going anywhere. Maybe this is because they knew what topic we were talking about. Just kidding. We're not going to be conspiracy theorists when we have so many real conspiracies in the world. Okay, Seth Rich. Back to what I was saying. Seth Rich was a DNC staffer who was murdered on the streets of Washington, D.C. years ago. And it was a strange set of circumstances because originally the narrative was that he was robbed and yet his wallet was found on his person. I believe it was his watch, his other belongings were on him. So it was odd and it sparked a lot of questions because it didn't appear to be a robbery that went bad. A lot of people wondered exactly what Seth Rich had been involved in. That's kind of the background. As I said, the "Who Killed Seth Rich" had become somewhat of a catchphrase on the right to question the deep state, I guess you could say. I hadn't heard that in a while until John Rich tweeted or posted it on X last night, and you responded with not just a comeback, not just is this a conspiracy? You responded with an explanation about something that happened in the wake of the murder of Seth Rich that I did not know, had not heard about. Could you expound on that for us now?
Well, it's highly relevant today because we are in a period with the potential of mass declassification of federal secrets. From what's happening at the State Department to USAID to Tulsi Gabbard's ODNI new effort at transparency. And what happened in 2016, around the time of the murder of Seth Rich, was the emergence of WikiLeaks with an impact on the 2016 election. The entire intelligence community was pulling for Hillary Clinton, who had just been the Secretary of State, which is a frequent stepping post to become president. Her husband was obviously president as well, and very deeply tied to the international statecraft world. And then in the middle of election season, these emails that were part of the DNC server ended up getting posted on WikiLeaks, and it became hugely embarrassing for the DNC. It caused a big divide between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and their camps in terms of showing all the maneuverings that were done in order to ensure that Hillary Clinton was the chosen one. And then lo and behold, this DNC staffer gets murdered, as you said, with none of his possessions taken. And many questions emerged were about whether Seth Rich was the source of the DNC leaks to WikiLeaks. And then there was email chatter that suggested that some folks in the John Podesta camp were vengeful about the leaks. Immediately after that, you had Julian Assange, who went on public television and said that and suggested that there should be some sort of bounty for whoever can find whoever killed Seth Rich. Now, Julian Assange has a policy at WikiLeaks of not disclosing sources. That way they can, this is just sort of their journalistic integrity, even though they were ultimately tried under the Espionage Act and hounded to the ends of the earth. WikiLeaks was. Obviously, Julian Assange spent many years holed up in an embassy and then hit with rape charges and then arrested under the Espionage Act. But there have been many attempts at investigating who really killed Seth Rich. There's the FBI took the laptop, sat on it, has blocked disclosures about it. A private investigator was hired. There are many shenanigans involving that, including defamation lawsuits to try to make the investigation go away, as we see happen as pretty much a standard checklist item now in order to sort of put cold water over the press. This is what Ray Epps did as well when he sued Fox News for defamation. It's what Nina Jankowicz did when she was fired from the Disinformation Governance Board. I, by the way, find the defamation to make media chatter die down to be very nasty. If I can do one quick aside before I come back to the Seth Rich story, everyone who's listening right now should look up a scandal called Mason Gate. It refers to an individual named Paul Mason, who is a former British statecraft, British intelligence operative who was upset at Max Blumenthal's outlet, The Gray Zone, at a time when the Gray Zone was publishing a lot of leaked information in the same way that WikiLeaks does. And Paul Mason sent around emails saying that the Gray Zone was undermining British soft power institutions, and something had to be done to stop it. And in these emails, he proposes basically three ways to get rid of the Gray Zone. The first is to get them, if I'm recalling this correctly, the first was to get them deplatformed from social media. The second was to get their advertising revenue killed. But the third, which they called the nuclear option, was to find a sympathetic plaintiff uh, for a defamation case and to bankrupt the outlet through lawfare. Now, this is effectively a kind of British statecraft, British intelligence operation to use defamation lawfare in order to, even without a case, even knowing that they had no case to go on, but to find one simply to shut the outlet up. And so I have extreme concerns when I see that as the answer to questions of intense public scrutiny. And
Mhm.
during that time, those questions of public scrutiny of Seth Rich were extremely intense prior to the defamation lawfare. You saw Sean Hannity talking about it on Fox News. You saw uh, Roger Stone and others make a big deal about this on social media and on the radio. So the FBI squatted on the laptop, and like with many things, like with the did Jeffrey Epstein, you know, Epstein didn't kill himself. Who killed Seth Rich became one of these mimetic rallying calls, and at the height of that, the FBI effectively killed the investigation while squatting on the evidence. And then, as the questions did not go away, they ended up outsourcing the question of how did the DNC server get hacked. And wouldn't you know, the determination that the FBI came up with was that Russia did it, not Seth Rich, not not an insider at the DNC, but it was Russia who actually hacked the DNC. And in order to make that determination, they hired a third party contractor that folks in the audience may know. It's CrowdStrike. Now, CrowdStrike is a sort of DNC intelligence cyber firm in the way that Perkins Coie is a sort of DNC intelligence law firm. It's got its roots in everything from Viktor Pinchuk, the Ukrainian oligarch who was the single largest individual donor to the Clinton Global Foundation, and a tool of U.S. intelligence, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to waging war against Russia, sort of one of the good guy oligarchs in Ukraine, as far as our own blob is concerned. Um, it was co-founded by Dmitry Alperovich, who came from the Atlantic Council, which has 7 CIA directors on its board and gets annual funding from the State Department and the Pentagon. But so CrowdStrike makes this determination that the DNC was actually hacked by Russia, and that's how WikiLeaks got the information. Of course, this is used as part of the basis of saying that WikiLeaks was a Russian aligned organization. So they killed two birds with one stone, but then they got a third bird, which was the creation of CISA. DHS created the our government's first domestic censorship agency. It's you can just think of CISA as being the censorship agency, but its technical name is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which its founder Chris Krebs would say we have the name security in our name twice because we just love security so much. Well, it was about securing the blob from public scrutiny on social media primarily, and they did this, but it was set up as a sort of compromise at the height of Russiagate. Because remember, Russiagate, that the Mueller probe didn't end until July 2019. This was passed by Congress and approved by the president in November 2018. This was right after the CrowdStrike determination of Russian hacking of the DNC. And the justification for the creation of CISA was that Russians were hacking the DNC. They could hack election software. We need campaigns and voting machines and our cyber infrastructure to be protected at the federal level by a dedicated new DHS agency who would then recruit hackers from NSA and CIA and FBI counterintelligence in order to form this kind of cyber squad. And then once the Russiagate probe died in July 2019, they transitioned from saying the Russians are hacking our voting machines and servers and software. Once Russiagate died down, they transitioned to saying, well, they're hacking our hearts and minds. They're hacking our public opinion, and so they transitioned to a countering propaganda, countering disinformation, and then shortly before the election, at one of their disinformation conferences, the senior advisor, who was also the close friend and business partner of Chris Krebs, a man named Alex Stamos, who formed the tip of the spear of the 120-person censorship squad that partnered with DHS called EIP. Kramos and Stebbs, I should know, I'm sorry, Stamos and Krebs would go on to form a two-person consultancy called the Krebs-Stamos Group just after Krebs got fired. Their first client was SolarWinds, the very cyber hacking event that DHS was designed to stop. Those two went into business and made them their private client for personal profit when their job was to stop it on behalf of the public at that same DHS CISA center. But the point is Seth Rich, his death was not only covered up, and it's as far as we know, there's really still no active investigation. And the FBI seized all the original evidence, as they do in all these cases. This is why I always say the FBI is where evidence goes to die, because they collect all the originals and then nobody gets to retain their own copies. And then they can simply kill something in an ongoing investigation that never ends. But the fact is they used that as the predicate to create CISA, the DHS censorship agency that effectively swung the 2020 election, as far as I'm concerned. Their work resulted in tens of millions of tweets being categorized as misinformation incidents and being targeted for censorship. And YouTube, Twitter 1.0, Facebook, TikTok, Reddit, Discord, they went after everything on social media. They claimed that over 7 million tweets were misinformation narratives about Dominion voting machines. While their job was to stop the voting machines from being hacked, they were simultaneously censoring anyone who questioned the voting machines. So they were both in charge of security and in charge of censorship of anyone who questioned security, the very same small cluster of people. But then just to bring this to a close here, DHS then set about saying that questions about Seth Rich themselves were disinformation. And in a DHS report that I publicly posted and done many videos about from October 2019, they explicitly target Roger Stone and Sean Hannity, and they have a whole matrix grid about how anyone who questions the death of Seth Rich has to be stopped, it has to be categorized as disinformation, has to be put on DHS's disinformation kill chain and treated as a cyber threat actor. So not only was Seth Rich's death used to create this censorship beast, the very specific incident was then targeted as a basis for domestic censorship.
I mean, by the way, the voting machines is another example of the Paul Mason playbook that you mentioned, where you stop any investigation, questions, allegations by using lawsuits to silence people, to bankrupt them. That, I mean, we just saw that in our country. It
Yes,
happened to anybody.
800 million
That's right.
settlement.
That's right. And people stopped talking about it because they were afraid of being bankrupted by it. I want to ask you about this disinformation kill chain, because that phrase is just the fact that our government would have a phrase like that and use it against the American people is shocking. I want to read two quick ads though. because we didn't do this at the top of the show. You guys know that I'm very pro-life, and that it's really the root of almost everything I do. Is I want to stand up for the dignity of every human life, the value of every human life, and I'm really proud to partner with Preborn. Preborn is, doing the work on the streets, ministering to women and unborn babies. Last year alone, Preborn's network of clinics rescued over 67,000 babies from abortion. I mean, conceptualize that many people. And you're a big part of this. You are the lifeblood to the work that they do on the streets. Your tax deductible donation of $28 sponsors one ultrasound, which, when a mom sees her unborn child on an ultrasound, it doubles that baby's chance of life. So, my question to you is really a challenge. How many lives can you save today? Please donate your best gift today. Just dial pound 250 and say the keyword baby. That's pound 250, keyword baby, or you can go to preborn.com/Liz. That's preborn.com/Liz. And if you feel so called, as abortion continues to rise, Preborn is expanding their life affirming care in the darkest corners of our nation to help more hurting women save more babies. If you have the financial means, would you consider a leadership gift to save babies in a big way? Your tax deductible donation of $15,000 will place a machine in a needy women's center, saving countless lives for years to come. Go to preborn.com/Liz. That's preborn.com/Liz. All right. Speaking of mothers, you guys, you got to get gifts for your mom. Mother's Day is coming up. It's actually right around the corner. It seems kind of early to me this year. So don't get caught off guard without a gift. My recommendation, if you want a gift your mom's going to love, is go with Kexi Cookies. Kexi Cookies it's a gourmet cookie company founded by Pat Gray's family. Yeah, the same Pat Gray that we work with here at Blaze Media. Kexi makes incredible bakery fresh cookies with real high quality ingredients. None of the junk, just amazing flavor. Don't wait. Go to Kexi.com right now. Use code Liz15 for an exclusive 15% discount. That's Liz15 at Kexi.com. Your mom deserves the best. Give her something that she will remember. Kexi.com. Use code Liz15. Okay, Mike, talk to me about this phrase, disinformation kill chain. Is this something that is still happening in the United States? Like, what's the status of CISA? Is this still a thing?
Yes, well, all of those. If I can just make one quick actually note, just to follow up to the previous segments that
Yeah.
relates to this, is I mentioned that CrowdStrike was contracted, by the FBI to make this determination about Russian involvement. Several years later, CrowdStrike was put under oath at a court hearing, and then ended up saying that they actually had no direct evidence that Russia had actually done the hack. So I feel remiss if I didn't note that there was actually no direct evidence that was cited. It was all circumstantial smoke and mirrors to make that. But it's related to this question about the disinformation kill chain. And I'll sort of explain what this is before describing how it's currently still alive and thriving in various parts, even though they're very much on the run. So, the disinformation kill chain is a censorship parallel to the cyber kill chain in the hacking world. So, in the hacking world, people respect the term cybersecurity. Nobody actually sees what's involved in it, because effectively, to be in that field, you need to be either CIA, NSA, FBI, or a private contractor who sort of does white hat work for a big tech company. And even then, you're all at the same conferences. You're all, a lot of it is national security clearance involved, or sanctions in some way. Um, but at the time that the censorship industry was created, around 2016, when it came home here to the US, there was no offensive power to be able to use federal resources to censor tweets on the internet. That concept did not exist. There was no job for it. The whole field of stopping disinformation was a CIA field around propaganda and control over information. We did countering disinformation work in Eastern Europe when we were trying to silence Russian aligned media outlets, but it was not a job that you did here in the US. You were not allowed to spend US taxpayer dollars on such a thing domestically. And so there was a kind of, to use the Freudian kind of, I believe it was the Freudian phrase. I don't know how else to say it, so I'm just going to say it as uncouth as it is. There was a kind of penis envy about the field of disinformation work, because it wasn't a real science. In the same way that people in the psychology field have a kind of penis envy about physics, like they're not a real. They wish they were. I'm going too deep down this. I'm sorry. That there's the same thing with the censorship space.
Right.
There was no function for it. There was no job title. It was not a real field. It just looked like censorship. And so they had to attach themselves to the concept of cybersecurity in
Mm.
every way, from their job titles to the federal agency and the federal agency names that they created to the concepts within the field itself. So there is a concept in the hacking and counter hacking world called the cyber kill chain, which is the idea that there are various levels at which you can stop a network attack, an attack into your network. And you can trace these cyber threat actors as they move through the system and how they, how they set up their proxies. And the censorship industry simply adopted this concept of a cyber kill chain, but conformed it to the censorship space so that it looked like what they were doing was scientific and it was sort of an applied model that was already in place. And they were simply bringing it to this other aspect of the cyber realm, which was misinformation online. And so this is really how they legitimized it. People said, okay, well, I guess it's sort of the same thing. And so this concept really debuted in 2017, 2018, and then it snowballed. It was popularized by places like the Atlanta Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab. The Atlanta Council, as I mentioned, has 7 CIA directors on their board, annual funding from the Pentagon and State Department. It was popularized by places like Graphica, which was the cycle. It was actually um, incubated in the Pentagon's Minerva Initiative, which is the Psychological Warfare Research Center. When the Pentagon wants to do psyops work, they rely on outside contractors and outside universities and outside for-profit consulting companies in order to sketch out and flesh out proposals for how to conduct psychological operations work from the Pentagon. And so Graphica helped popularize this. There was an individual named Ben Nimmo who played a large role in popularizing this disinformation kill chain field. He was the technical lead at both the Atlanta Council and Graphica. He started his career as in the NATO office doing propaganda for NATO. His name was in the files for the Integrity Initiative, which was a busted British intelligence operation to censor the internet prior to the 2016 election, right after the fiasco in 2014 Ukraine. But the disinformation kill chain is not only alive and well. There was actually a large conference in London back in March called the Disinformation Kill Chain. It was a joint U.S. UK military exercise where they did tabletop exercises, half of which were classified, in which two high level U.S. military officials attended. One of them, I believe, was a 2-star general. On the British side of this, the UK side, because it's hosted in London. This is, by the way, we're back to London. If you're noticing a pattern here, it was London. It was the same Christopher Steele network that ended up creating that Russiagate dossier. As I mentioned, Paul Mason, came from that British intelligence world. Nina Jankovic, who filed one of those lawsuits on the defamation side, was a part of this network as well. Her name was also in the Integrity Initiative files alongside Ben Nimmo, who popularized this disinformation kill chain concept. She also became a registered agent for the British Crown after she was terminated from the Disinformation Governance Board as something called the Center for Information Resilience. That just means psychological resilience against false and misleading information. It's the same sort of censorship work, and that was sponsored by USAID. So it's the same sort of US UK blob network that was doing this disinformation kill chain. And the head of it from the UK side, who hosted this conference with US military officials, publicly came out and said that the world breathed a sigh of relief when Joe Biden won the 2020 election, that Donald Trump was the worst president in US history, that he was racist, misogynist, homophobic, Islamophobic, xenophobic, cancer on American history, and that he needs to effectively be purged from it. The whole thing was rotted top to bottom with not only never Trumpers, but the same sort of operatives who were involved in censoring the American internet. And so I think that this whole concept needs to be deconstructed. It needs to be raised to the ground. Every single cent of US funding towards it needs to be killed, because that funding is coming from the Pentagon, coming from the
Mhm.
State Department, coming from USAID, coming from the National Science Foundation. And now there's a whole other question about how deeply involved the intelligence community was, given that all of these other public facing agencies are often proxies for the intelligence community. I think this needs to be part of the ODNI's dig effort, this transparency effort, to root out the full extent of the CIA, the NSA, DARPA, and other places that deal with classified files as to their role in things like the disinformation kill chain and the effort to censor the internet.
Who hosted that conference in London? Who was that sponsored by? That wasn't a UK government sponsored thing, was it?
Well, the sponsors included groups like Graphica itself. Graphica, by the way, was one of the first movers in the COVID-19 censorship story. I should note, Graphica began, according to their own files, in December 19. When I published a piece on this, they said no, actually we started in January 19, but we backdated our searches to December. That's why it looks like this. Of course, the pneumonia-like symptoms broke out in Wuhan on December 12th. So for the very same week, for a Pentagon PSYOP contractor to be mapping worldwide disinformation about COVID origins in order to stop anyone from talking about how it may have come from the Pentagon itself, when they're getting $7 million in government contracts from the Pentagon to do psychological operations work, and they're explicitly targeting US citizens. They created a whole network map of every single right-wing political group, left-wing political group, both in the US and in every NATO country, who was questioning whether or not this may have been a man-made leak. And meanwhile, they're being contracted by the very people who are effectively on the defense stand, uh, in order to do this work, while they are, getting money from them, and while they are working with these same CIA, NATO networks. But the fact is it was everyone can look this up. It was called the Phoenix Conference, and I'll publish the subscriber. I did a whole 3-hour video deconstructing the whole thing and what their tabletop exercises were about. The premise of it was primarily around, uh, you know, I know this is shock of all shocks, but countering Russian disinformation. Right, the whole thing is framed as, well, Russia is still influencing hearts and minds in Ukraine, and they're influencing hearts and minds in the West, and people are, it's undermining support for funding in Ukraine, and so that undermines the U.S. and U.K. war efforts against Russia. So now it's a military jurisdiction about whether the media is pushing people to support one or another side of the funding, and so this is how you get long arm jurisdiction over civilian media by the U.S. and NATO militaries.
Well, it just makes a little more sense, I think, when you hear these absurd allegations that everything that the left doesn't like or the blob doesn't like is Russian disinformation. It makes more sense after you explained how CISA came into existence after Seth Rich, and how they took their role in actually combating foreign, or not even combating, but political warfare over in Eastern Europe, and they just applied that playbook to the US. Well, it makes sense that they're literally applying the same playbook. They're like, well, we might as well accuse them of the same thing, since that's what we know how to do. Let me circle back to that question. What is the status on CISA today? Do we know who runs it? Do we know if Trump is aware that this is happening within his government?
I don't actually know the current status of CISA. There were attempts to, um, obviously, Christy Nome as DHS head has. Uh, I've had the opportunity to brief her on many of these things, and I there was an opportunity for myself as well to be able to play a role directly in CISA. Um, but the fact is I have not seen DHS CISA do the kind of things that it was doing for its first several years. This was a lot. It became highly scandalized during the time of the Twitter files.
Mhm.
I published what was probably the definitive report on the origins and scope of the CISA censorship apparatus. in 2022, and it became a huge scandal for DHS. They were sued by multiple outside parties. There were about 5 different congressional hearings on it. There was a big battle in the budget to try to defund it in 2021, 2020. I'm sorry, in 2022, 2023. CISA ended up winning that battle at the time, but in return, they pledged that they would never do this sort of work again, that it was sort of a child of its time. They ended up ripping down all the YouTube videos that for their, don't worry, I have archives of all of it. But the fact is they ended up taking down all of the YouTube videos where they bragged about doing this work. They ended up purging the website, still available on the Wayback Machine, but they ended up purging all the references to domestic censorship work that they were doing. They have not rekindled these networks that they were involved in from 2018 to 2023, 2024. I do have open questions about CISA's continuing role in federal elections. This is something, frankly, that would be a very easy win for the Trump administration if they simply undid the executive order. This was the last act. I sometimes call January 6, 2017 the other January 6th because it's such a day of infamy with lingering questions and unresolved scandals around it. Obama's outgoing DHS Secretary Jed Johnson made a determination at DHS on as sort of his last act of the Obama administration at DHS. This is while Russiagate was being cooked up during the initial Trump transition after he won in 2016, and the determination was that elections are critical infrastructure. Uh, Now, that determination effectively federalizes national elections, and instead of it being elections being a conglomeration of 50 states all sort of taking care of their own infrastructure, taking care of their own election process, it put DHS in the middle of all 50 states. And at the time, all 50 states signed a letter opposing this action, and then basically a bribery slush fund was opened up to woo the states one by one into joining this DHS coalition around the federalized elections.
Right.
It ended up being ratified by Trump's DHS, his first DHS secretary, John Kelly. If folks remember the scandals around John Kelly, he would go on to become Trump's chief of staff and then be fired in a ball of flames. He ended up then being a big whistleblower and claiming that Trump loved Hitler and doing this whole DNC media tour. But he was the one who, in March 2017, ratified that order, which became the basis for CISA's censorship work and CISA's operations. Because that order, critical infrastructure is something that people think are, low Earth orbit satellites or subsea cables or dams, or you could argue maybe something like hospitals. But what they did is they said, well, elections are critical infrastructure. So anything that impacts elections, it's a metaphysical concept. Your speech supporting Donald Trump is now a part of the critical infrastructure of DHS's jurisdiction. They did this when DHS moved into censoring COVID-19. And I published all the documents on this. Tucker Carlson covered it. They ended up purging it, when all the COVID stuff went sideways for them. But how did DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency get the jurisdiction to create instructional videos for children to report their parents to Facebook for disinformation if they question CDC figures? Well, the answer is they said public health is critical infrastructure. And so anything that undermines public faith and confidence in our public health institutions is now a cyber domain at CISA. And so this whole concept of critical infrastructure had this mission creep, and it can all be unwound by executive order. And I'm glad that you bring this up because that's something that I think would be a very easy win for the Trump administration, and it would make our elections freer, and it would forbid legally the kind of abuses that we've been seeing out of DHS.
Right. Because my concern would be even if CISA has been um, reduced in size and scope, my fear would be that it lays dormant just until it rears its ugly head again, and that the Trump administration should thoroughly investigate who is in charge of it, what powers it has, what can be done to eradicate it, let alone just defunding it. Sounds like critical infrastructure is a good place to start. Okay, another thing, this is shifting topics, but I have to get your take on this because something that you have been talking about recently is the CIA assassination manual. I think a lot of us know that the CIA takes part in this kind of stuff, and it's chilling to see, like, to lift the curtain and see just how clinical they are on killing people. Tell us what you found in this assassination manual. What's their modus operandi?
Well, it's important to note that the CIA is still in charge of assassinations today in the drone program. The drone program is still targeted assassinations that are done, many of them highly controversial, and not necessarily productive to our counterinsurgency work when we do drone strikes at weddings and then everybody watches the Central Intelligence Agency blow up all their friends and family, even if they are affiliated with these horrible groups. So there's an open question about the ethics of that work today. But at the time, this was in the 1950s, in Guatemala. The CIA was created under the 1947 Act, National Security Act, really began operating in 1948, and in its first 20 years or so, there was no oversight of the CIA, so it could get away with murder, so to speak. There was no Senate Intelligence Committee or House Intelligence Committee until the 1970s with the Church Committee hearings. Although we have a bad history of folks with the intelligence committees. I should note today, Adam Schiff, of course, was the head of the House Intelligence Committee. Mark Warner, who's helped spearhead the censorship efforts every step of the way for the past 8 years, is the head of the Senate Intelligence was the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. But the fact is what I published and read out loud on a recent stream with the CIA assassination guide was a time before oversight when assassinations were a tool of statecraft. They were done. The U.S. at the time was responsible for assassinating effectively world leaders, whether that was Lumumba, Arbenz, Allende. There was, but even down to low level folks, this was a way of making problems go away. This was a way of burying evidence. This was a way of effectively solving problems that could not be solved through other means. And famously, folks may recall in 1975, 20 years after this document that I'll describe here in a second, the CIA actually held up, I believe it was William Colby, who was testifying on behalf of the CIA in front of the Church Committee hearings. Everyone can look this up on YouTube. The CIA held up when they were pressed a heart attack gun that is effectively fired a dart that would induce a heart attack in someone so that when they were assassinated, it would look like they died of natural causes by a heart attack. Now, given that a heart attack is, I believe, one of the top 3 causes of death in the US and worldwide, this is a very, very convenient way of killing someone and not making it look like it was a CIA assassination because it's one of the most common causes of death in the world. But in this guide, the CIA was doing a study of how to carry out assassinations and getting away with it so that it would minimize investigation afterwards. And they go over several methods of doing so. These involve everything from bare hands, wires, small arms, to dropping people out of windows. Famously, in this CIA study, they recommend that one of the cleanest causes of death, if you can arrange a meeting with the target uh, in a building with a hard surface below that is more than 7.5 stories tall. They give a height of 75 feet is the surface at which you can be. That's the height at which you can be confident that someone will be dead on impact, and that their organs will be sufficiently scrambled that a forensic audit of their body will not reveal blunt force trauma that was done to them prior to the fall. So they recommend that agents case a building, arrange a meeting on other pretenses with the subject, and then drop them off of a tall window. Now, what's very interesting about this is there was a famous COVID-19. Now, I don't know the facts of the case beyond this. I just have a personal habit of when I enter a building now of noting, if there's a potentially open window that's 8 stories or taller, that there was a famous case of a COVID-19 whistleblower in at the Wuhan lab who was involved in the high level bat research, the bat coronavirus research, and was talking publicly about the malfeasance happening at the Wuhan lab. And then, amazingly, this whistleblower um, tossed themselves off of the top of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which, when I looked it up, appeared to be 8 stories tall.
Ugh.
So you see this sort of thing playing out today, and you can understand for operational security when something is going to impact the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world is going to be a potential scandal that implicates, for example, the Pentagon or U.S. intelligence for decades to come. That you could see by their logic, one death to save potentially billions of dollars and millions of lives in whatever conflict might arise from these scandals. You could see that calculus potentially checking out, especially given that you have the CIA involvement in COVID-19 from so many angles, whether that's the $15 million of payment from USAID, the CIA funding conduit, directly to the Wuhan lab, well, I should say via EcoHealth Alliance, and the participation of folks like Deputy CIA Director Avril Haines at Event 201. And then Avril Haines was then made the head, she was made the Director of National Intelligence, the boss over the CIA once the Biden administration took office. But the fact is we don't know whether or not this still happens. If it does happen, it would be done through informal networks. It would be done, you would not have a written record of this sort of thing. These were direct action by the CIA at a time when there was no legal barrier to doing so. So, to the extent this work is still done, it'll be done indirectly through their contacts in organized crime, which are alive and well on every populated continent, whether that's working with the narco gangs in Mexico and Colombia, or whether that's working with the ISIS and Taliban folks in Syria and Afghanistan and Pakistan, or whether that's working with folks in terrorist organizations like the Azov Battalion in Ukraine, who I should note we've now had 2 assassination attempts on the president flowing through that exact same organized crime network.
That sound you hear right now is hundreds of thousands of people watching this, taking note never to take a meeting in any building higher than the 7th floor. That's what you hear right now going on. When you're talking about stuff happening worldwide, though, you recently, I think this was yesterday actually, posted on X that there's an undeclared second Cold War on populism that's happening both abroad but also here at home. Um, and I want to hear what your summary of this, because we talked a couple weeks ago on the show, by the way, about what happened to Marine Le Pen and how these
Yes.
populist leaders all around the world are getting the same treatment that Trump has gotten here at home. Is this a concerted effort by the blob? And if so, what does the playbook look like?
Yes, concerted, organized, networked, financed. Um, it's a professional job, and this is a massive story that I think has not been fully told. And I articulate this concept of a second undeclared Cold War, a second Cold War in the form of an undeclared war on populism, because I hope it to be a guiding concept for all the different federal agencies who were weaponized in furtherance of this war and who may not know what to look for when they're searching for classified documents at ODNI, when they're searching for State Department cables and communications, when they're searching through USAID records, when they're searching through Pentagon files and the like. And that is that this concept of the transition of our blob apparatus, blob just meaning foreign policy establishment at the transatlantic level, from the US to the UK and NATO, to France, to Germany. There's a professional, when you're in the international affairs world, you network with all of your counterparts, and you form these networks. These networks take the form of not just officials at the various ministries of foreign affairs, but also at the think tanks, at the NGOs, at the university centers, at the media organizations, even at the union level, at the commercial level. So there is this. This is who everyone in the blob, their friends, their family, often their cocktail parties, their wedding invites, are all the other people in this same cohort. And starting really with the 2016 election of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote that happened just months beforehand, the intelligence apparatus that was set up to stop communism was left-wing communism was repurposed to stop right-wing populism. And this is, when you understand the implications of that, it should be totally terrifying and demand a complete inquiry into every single file from every single agency who participated in this. And this was pretty much every agency in the federal government at some point. For example, there was a 26 government agency interagency working group on information integrity to stop populism set up by the Biden administration in December 2021. 26 government agencies in that one group alone, and those included the Pentagon, USAID, the CIA, the NSA, places that are highly classified. But where I'm going with this is we we knew that we were in a Cold War in the 20th century. We had a U.S. information agency, actually, which is the predecessor to the Global Engagement Center at State. We had propaganda reels that were public, produced by the U.S. government, that were played before every movie. You had, we had a very visceral rallying call for involvement in military interventions all over the world. It was called the Cold War in the Cold War. This was not something we had to look back at. It had a start date and an end date, in the sense that it started the moment World War II ended, and it ended the moment the Berlin Wall came down. It is a defined period of history marked by the active participation of the CIA, the DoD, the State Department, USAID, the NGOs, the universities, all aligned as one common magnet against one common enemy, and that was left-wing communism, and by proxy, socialism. You see the same thing that happened starting in 2016 with populism and by proxy nationalism, except coming from the right, except the threat was the right. And this was, of course, during the Obama era in 2016, when this all played out, when you had a sort of left-wing control over the CIA, over the DoD, over USAID, and you had a very powerful half of the Republican Congress, a very powerful, probably 3/4 of the top leadership on the Republican side, who were allied in this effort, in the same way that many Democrats were allied with the Nixon and Eisenhower and Reagan Republicans, because left-wing communism posed a problem for left-wing hedge funds and left-wing financiers who were looking to gobble up billions of dollars in state-held wealth by communist countries. So you had a sort of 2 against 1 during the Cold War, and by the way, I hate communism. I'm not even challenging, what was done in the Cold War in this context. I'm simply saying that everyone knew we were in it, and whether you agreed with it or not, it was a declared policy. But what happened is the internationalist wing of the Republican Party teamed up with the entirety of the Democrat Party to weaponize the State Department, the Defense Department, the CIA, USAID, the NGOs, all of the tentacles of the blob in civil society, media, private sector, and government were all done as a concerted effort to go after populism qua populism, which means that Trump in the US, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Marine Le Pen in France, the AfD party in Germany, the Vox party in Spain, Matteo Salvini in Italy, you could simply throw a dart at the globe, and I could just go to journalofdemocracy.org, the National Endowment for Democracy's in-house journal, or I could go to the state.gov website or the CI World Factbook online and just look at any blob source that uses a phrase like threat to democracy or that uses a phrase like populist, and I will tell you where 100% of the money is going in that country from the State Department to try to rig that election, to try to use rule of law programs to get the people there arrested, to try to work with the union groups to organize protests, to try to work with to build independent media, to write hit pieces on that political opponent. It's as predictable as calling someone communist in the 20th century by looking at any State Department document with the word populist. And so I believe that we need a full mass declassification of that search term, populism, populist. And I believe that if you produce something like the JFK files for that, it will be a forensic audit of the weaponization of the entire intelligence community against Americans. This was in the Biden national security strategy document. In 2022, they referenced how populism was causing a problem for U.S. national security because when populist leaders get elected, they don't like having military bases there. Hey, what just happened in Romania? They canceled the election and now they arrested Kalin Georgescu because he didn't want a NATO military base there. Did the same thing in Bangladesh, ousting the prime minister there when she didn't want a military base. Also about military funding, also about allowing arms transshipments. There are any number of reasons that there are national security predicates that you can use to justify this. And I believe every single document that involves that needs to be known so that this history can be told.
Is that a Tulsi thing? Would she be the one to, because she's DNI, to declassify that?
Yes.
A Tulsi thing. So there's basically two calls to action from this show. There's DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, and this would pretty obviously need to be endorsed by Trump, needs to declassify all the documents related to populism. And then we also need a status update on CISA, which can start with an executive order from Trump reversing the Obama executive order declaring elections to be critical infrastructure, which federalizes the elections. Two things.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I would add that every government agency, in addition to ODNI, who I believe works primarily with the classified at the classified layer, there are also going to be SBU, sensitive but unclassified communications at USAID, at the State Department, at the Pentagon. And so an independent effort could be made at all agencies. And that is consistent with the global executive order that Trump filed day one about that every single government agency has an obligation under that executive order to determine how those resources within that agency were weaponized against the American people. And I believe simply doing a search of files for those search terms, populism and populist, will net within those agencies an incredible treasure trove that will literally rewrite U.S. history books.
And that's our job. Everyone here today, that's our job. Raise your voices. I mean, these are our marching orders, is to make sure that our elected officials and the appointed officials at these agencies know what we want. That's one of the incredible things about President Trump, is he listens to his voters. He responds to our requests and our demands, especially when it's uncovering corruption. So make your voices heard on X, on all social media platforms, call, email. These are the things that we want. These two things: the declassification of files from federal agencies that talk about populism and use the term populist, and then an executive order from Trump that reverses Obama's executive order declaring elections to be critical infrastructure, which essentially federalizes. So get to work. Let's get this done. Mike Benz, thank you for your time. You're, by the way, I don't know if you've been looking at the live chat. You are well loved in the live chat. Somebody said I could sit here and listen to Mike Benz educate all day. And we really appreciate
I
you
love the
taking
live
time.
chat too. The chat always wins. So thank you,
Yes,
Liz.
yes, it does. Thank you for being here. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right, bye.
Okay, guys, make sure you're subscribed. YouTube.com/Liz Wheeler, X.com Liz_Wheeler. Go to Spotify. We have video over there now, so you can watch the video. You can comment under each individual episode. Love to see all the people that have been joining us over there. Make sure you're signed up for our newsletter too, LizWheelerNewsletter.com. Thank you for watching today. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.